Yes, you were saying something about extraterrestrials, weren't you?
Well, yeah, I think we got straight into the topic of extraterrestrials. It's, I think, something that's been on the thoughts of a lot of people over the past few years, with the rise of various internet websites and obviously various public figures talking about it. You had the Canadian minister who came out and admitted to the American government, or disclosed the American government were in contact with various alien races. So there's a lot of different interesting talk about extraterrestrials at the moment, and I suppose it's very difficult for lots of people to get their head around this idea. And in one sense, it makes complete sense. Of course, how could we possibly be alone in this universe, even in this galaxy? But in another sense, it's the whole seeing is believing attitude of humans, really. And I think that's what makes it difficult for a lot of people to get their heads around it, especially when you've got so much crazy talk and people who are clearly fabricating stories of kidnaps and sightings, etc., combined with what is actually really going on and what's real.
Yeah. I like this seeing is believing, because I think that's a fundamental point in to the subject. In the 1960s, the 3D consensus up until a certain point had everyone by the short and curlies. We really were completely imprisoned in the 3D construct. So my childhood, my upbringing, my teens, that's what it was. And all of a sudden 1966, 67, 68 happened, and it decided to have a thorough shake-up. And what shook it up was people, particularly of a certain generation, taking substances which affected their consciousness, and that was it. From that moment onwards, everything was different. So the way I understand the whole extraterrestrial thing is as follows, which is, if you are completely enmeshed in a third-dimensional reality, then it's all bullshit. There are no extraterrestrials, it's fabrication, it's made up, and there is no such thing happening. What to me is fascinating about the time we're living in now is that what's very clearly happening is that the 3D construct is starting to tremble, it's shaking, the cracks are appearing, it's wobbling, it's no longer the certain thing that it was when I was growing up, and that to me is incredibly exciting. So as the 3D consensus starts to wobble, people's perceptions of other beings, which includes extraterrestrials and other kind of beings, which we might get to look at as well, starts to become a possibility. So here's one way to look at it. There's an incredibly simple definition which comes from a guy called Chris Thomas, and he's been a healer in Wales with his wife Diane Baker for well over 30 years now. And this is his take on it. He talks about 3 forms of existence, which I find this very helpful. I love it when someone comes up with simple models. So there's a very simple model of shamanism, which we'll look at in another podcast, but this is the simple model for forms of existence. You've got fully physical. Human beings, animals, plants, rocks, we are fully physical existence. That's what we are. And here's the huge joke, the massive joke, is that because this is all that we're familiar with, we think this is all it is. This is incredibly rare in the universe. And as I understand it, it looks very likely that we're unique. So fully physical existence, what to us is the norm, is actually the ultimate rarity in the universe. What you have far more than fully physical existence is semi-physical existence. And the difference between the two is really subtle, and I use the word advisedly, because with fully physical existence we have a form which is dense matter. With semi-physical beings, what you have is beings which are made of a more subtle material. In other words, their vibration is higher, the material they're made from is lighter. So lighter and higher are useful words to understand what semi-physical beings are. So if you're a human being that can tune into a reasonably wide range of frequency possibilities, then for you extraterrestrials are an obvious established fact, because you've known them for a very long time, because your ability to sense subtle realms of energy is something you're used to and familiar with. Imagine if you're not. Imagine if you're not used to that, you're not familiar with that, then it's going to seem very alien. That's the word that you would use. It was going to seem alien.
There's also the other possibility in that it's something that I think most humans have felt or been connected to at some point, that I think gets drilled out of you from a very young age, that actually, I know people who've had imaginary friends, and it's been drilled out of them that imaginary friend is just that, imaginary, so put it to one side, it doesn't exist, it's not happening, because it's not in this physical, we can see it with our senses.
Exactly, and you've used the word imaginary, and that is a key I need to follow up on, because if you break down the word imagination or imaginary, it is I, which is a sense of self, and then mage, I, magus, I, magician. So imagination is actually you being a magician, which I'm going to relate to God or Goddess consciousness, the ability to create. However, I need to just loop us back to where we were, because we talked about fully physical beings,
yes, of course,
with full corporeality, semi-physical beings, more subtle. So if a semi-physical being was to walk across my window right now, if I was looking directly at the window I wouldn't see anything, but if I was looking somewhere else, then I might detect a movement out of the corner of my eye. That's a much easier way for a 3D being to detect a semi-physical being.
Which, of course, I imagine people will admit happens all the time. They catch something in the corner of their eye,
indeed,
and there's nothing there.
Indeed. And then there's a third category. The third category are the non-physical beings. They have no physical substance whatsoever. They are entirely energy beings. So you've got beings of matter, which is all of us earth beings that we're familiar with. We've got the semi-physical beings, which are what people regard to be the ETs, the extraterrestrials, and we've got the non-physical beings, for which there are some human labels, and one of the human labels that people use is the word angel. So this is your explanation of angels. Angels are non-physical beings. And just to throw in some controversy, there's also includes the demons, which are non-physical beings too.
I was listening to something about Enochians and Enochian magic, and that the definitions we have of angels and demons in terms of good and bad aren't necessarily correct, and that they shouldn't be limited to those definitions.
That's a good one, because you've brought up the subject of good and bad. If you're living in a completely dualistic perception of reality, that's how you're going to see things. You're going to want to label things as good and bad, because frankly you're going to feel very uncomfortable if you don't. But once you leave behind dualistic concepts, you realise how incredibly limiting they are. And so really the idea of categorising non-physical beings into angels and demons is just the way that the limited human mind would use to attempt to grasp something which is so massive it's almost ungraspable. Now here's the interesting thing to me. If you were to talk about percentages incredibly crudely and talk about life, then 99% of all life is approximately, that's your non-physical beings. So non-physical beings, 99% of everything, and then there's 1% left. Out of that 1% left, we would say that 0.9% would be semi-physical beings, that's the extraterrestrials, and only 0.1% physical beings. And I've used a percentage system which is not strictly speaking accurate. It would be far more extreme than that. It's just a way to show you that we are the minority of the minority of the minority.
Right, okay.
Very special case.
So, just before, I really want to ask you a bit more about that, and what else is going on with the non-physical beings. But what I think is being raised a lot is extraterrestrials that are physical. Do they exist?
It depends on your mindset, and I use the word mindset deliberately because the more set your mind is, the more convinced you are they don't exist. It's really simple. If you are completely enmeshed in 3D reality, it's all bollocks and they don't exist. As soon as you start to open up beyond that, then you start to realise that,
Would I as an individual have to open up to it to be able to see an extraterrestrial, or would an extraterrestrial be able to appear before me in a physical form and be like, ha, I'm real?
Right, let me put it this way. For an extraterrestrial being to adopt full physicality is not easy.
Okay.
It would require effort, it would require work to be able to do so. There's very little advantage to be gained from them to do so, because the vast majority of extraterrestrial beings have realised that we're not terribly bright as a race. We've got a long way to go in our evolution, and the standard default human mode to go into for anything that they don't understand is fear. And fear, I always think of the best way to give an example of fear is a gun. A gun is simply fear that's solidified into physical form. That's what a gun is. If you feel the need to walk around with a gun, that means you are either consciously or unconsciously so frightened that that is the thing that you need to be able to cope. So extraterrestrials, seeing many human beings armed to teeth, there's very little incentive for them to choose to become fully physical. It does require effort to do so, and there are many examples where this has happened, and there are certain people who record such stories. There's a guy called Creda Mutwa, a South African shaman, who's recorded many stories of extraterrestrial beings have become fully physical for short periods of time. There's a work of David Icke which goes into endless examples of people who have witnessed such things. So, yeah.
So, I mean, looking at some of the stories the stories seem to predominantly come from the US, that I've seen anyway, of extraterrestrials. There's the images of the alien bodies from Roswell and in various US establishments where they're doing autopsies, or where there's aliens in glass cases, etc., etc. Is that all hoax and nonsense, or is there something more to that?
That's a really interesting question, and not having had access to those locations, it's something that I'm not able to know. But what I am aware of is that in as much as there are many different races of human beings, there are also many different ET races. That I have no doubt about. I think what I need to do is to say a little bit about what I do, and then that will give something of an answer to this subject. I do shamanic healing work, and when I was trained to work with guides. However, when I completed my training, about a year later I was taken offline and did no healing work for a month. And just before that happened, I was introduced to two extraterrestrial beings that were definitely not guides. They were given a different category. They were called helpers. And when I got introduced to these two, I was introduced them by a fellow shaman, a brother shaman of mine called David the Shaman Chef. He invited me to do a shamanic journey with him to find out if these beings wanted to work with me and if I wanted to work with them on the healing. I did the journey, the instant sense of recognition and belonging, and it was yes, yes. They instantly introduced me to two other beings. So I have 4 extraterrestrial beings that I call my helpers, and I work with them whenever I do my healing work. It's like every single time I work with them. Now here's my attempt to explain my understanding. I have never witnessed these beings in any physical sense whatsoever. The only time I witness them is when I go into a light trance state, either through the breathing work or through the drumming, and journeying with my intention to their location, I then meet them. For the first quite a few times I met them, they chose to appear in a form which would be easier for me to understand. Now, I think this is the point I'm trying to get to with the ET races, is that they're very aware of how difficult it is for human beings. Even the ones that have got a relatively open attitude like me don't find it easy, so they manifest in a particular form. And somewhere I've still got the drawings I made of these. Imagine humanoid beings wearing blue jumpsuits, right? Well, 2 of them have these blue jumpsuits on, and there was a patch here and a patch there which was yellow, and on the chest a patch there and a patch there was yellow. So blue with 4 yellow patches. That was one pair of these beings, and they were happy to be named, and this is an important issue I want to bring in. Padermo and the Major are their names. The other two don't play that game. They regard names to be irrelevant and a construct that we find useful on this planet. My understanding about these two races, they have no need whatsoever for names. If they give names, they're just pandering to us. They're helping us to understand them. Because why would they need a name when every being has an energy signature and they can read this? It's irrelevant to them. So the other pair of beings without the names, blue jumpsuits and a red patch here and a red patch there and a red patch there and a red patch there. So for the first month or two as I was working with these beings on a regular basis, that's how they presented themselves. After a while they realised that I was ready for the next level, and so they showed me what they look like without the camouflage, and what I saw was the same humanoid shape but more elongated, and very, very important, they were iridescent radiant light beings. So what I actually saw is something that's very hard to describe in words, and anyone who's experienced plant medicines will instantly know what I'm talking about, because these beings are just radiating light of all colours I'm familiar with and colours I'm unfamiliar with. They're just radiant light beings. And I felt that was like a great affirmation of my ability to see them, that they chose to allow me to see them as they are, rather than as they thought would be easier for me to take.
So the concept that most people have of little green men flying around the planet in metal plates is complete nonsense.
I don't say it's nonsense, because the way I see it is that we are presented with information in a form which is acceptable to us and intelligible to us. And as time goes on, our perceptions develop. For example, there was a time that we all thought that a rocket was going to look like, at the 1950s, it's got this special needle-shaped pointed tip and coming down like that, and that was what a rocket was going to look like. And then the first rockets that started to be produced looked rather like that, a little bit more boxy but quite similar. And as time has gone on, we realise that as soon as you leave Earth's gravitational well behind, and you see it especially in all science fiction stories, and a lot of, well, think of Red Dwarf for example, there is an interstellar vehicle. It doesn't look anything like the old 1950s conception. It's got all sorts of bits and pieces, it's all joined together, and look at the International Space Station, it's a conglomeration of bits and pieces. So our perception of what a rocket or a space station could be changes with our evolution. So I think it's the same thing with these. What I have heard, which I rather like, is there's one particular form of extraterrestrial which people call greys. And they're quite short, and they're grey, and they've got large heads, and they've got these very big eyes. I remember reading in the last couple of years or so that those are just the suits they wear. And as soon as that was, I thought, well, yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. That's why they look so uniform, because, you know, human dudes in spacesuits, they all look pretty much the same, white with the big globes, don't they? It's the same thing. So I think that's a good way to understand how perception is as far as you're able to go in terms of your understanding of things.
That's quite interesting. I just had a vision of a planet in the far off galaxy with all the aliens imagining us as astronauts.
Exactly.
Looking like astronauts.
Exactly.
When we look completely different.
Yeah, I rather like that. That's quite good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.